You hear the name Dracula, and your mind jumps straight to Halloween. A pale man in a black cape, red lips, sharp teeth, a bad Transylvanian accent saying, "I want to suck your blood." That's what Hollywood gave you. That's what cartoons drilled into your head. Dracula equals vampire. Vampire equals bats, coffins, and cheap costumes sold every October. But here's the truth. History lied. Vlad III Dracula, better known as Vlad the Impaler, wasn't born in a coffin. He didn't sleep upside down. And he sure didn't spend his nights flirting with tourists in Gothic castles. He was a prince. A real one. Ruler of Wallachia, a tiny land trapped between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. And instead of sipping blood, he spilled it. By the thousands. Against one of the most powerful empires on earth. Before he was a monster of legend. He was the nightmare of sultans. So how did that man, a national defender, a real warlord, turn into a cartoon villain? The answer is simple. Propaganda. Fake news didn't start with Twitter. It started with the printing press. German pamphlets. Woodcuts. Sensational headlines that sold faster than truth ever could. They called him a monster, a cannibal, a blood drinker, and people bought it literally. The more gruesome the story, the higher the sales. Sound familiar? But the real Vlad was smarter, darker, and far more terrifying than any Hollywood vampire. He didn't need fangs. He had stakes. And when Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, marched into Wallachia, he found 20,000 corpses on spikes, a forest of the dead. A warning written in blood? The Sultan looked at that scene and turned back. That's who Vlad really was. Not a monster of fiction, but a man who used fear as his fortress. The West turned him into a vampire. Romania remembers him as a hero. One man, two legends. And 500 years later, we're still confusing the monster with the man who made monsters run. To understand Vlad, you have to understand the world he was thrown into. Europe, the 15th century, not a calm, noble place. It was a chessboard, but the pieces were soaked in blood. And right in the middle of it sat a tiny strip of land called Wallachia. If you open a map today, you'll find it in modern Romania. But back then, it wasn't really a country. It was a buffer zone, a speed bump between giants. To the north, Hungary Christian and proud. To the south, the Ottoman Empire rising fast, unstoppable, hungry for Europe. Wallachia was the hallway between two angry neighbors. And young Vlad, he was born right in the middle of their shouting match. Now, here's the cruel joke. You'd think being a buffer state keeps you safe, right? If both sides need you, maybe they leave you alone. Wrong. In the 15th century, being a buffer state meant being everyone's favorite punching bag. They didn't want to protect you. They wanted to own you. Vlad's father, Vlad III Dracula, learned that the hard way. He tried to keep peace with both empires. He joined the Order of the Dragon, sworn to defend Christianity against the Turks. But defend often meant sacrifice. The Ottomans wanted tribute. Hungary wanted loyalty. And Wallachia just wanted to exist. That was the world Vlad was born into. A world where loyalty changed faster than seasons. Where promises were inked in blood. Where survival meant outsmarting everyone, including your friends. Imagine being born in a house between two armed neighbors. Every night, one knocks on your door. The next night, the other, both demanding taxes, soldiers, obedience. And if you say no, they burn your house down. That was Wallachia. That was home. It's no wonder that cruelty became normal. The Ottomans enslaved, the Hungarians schemed, the boyars, the Wallachian nobles betrayed their own rulers like clockwork. Treachery wasn't shocking. It was the weather, and young Vlad, he watched it all. He didn't invent brutality. He just learned that in his world, mercy was a weakness. So before he was ever called the Impaler, before the legends, before the blood, he was just a boy, born into a place that demanded monsters to survive. And soon, he would become one. Before he became the Impaler, before the forests of stakes, Vlad was a boy, And that boy's childhood was not about toys, or tutors, or royal banquets. It was about fear and control. His father, Vlad III Dracula, was cornered. Two empires breathing down his neck. Hungary demanding loyalty, and the Ottomans demanding obedience. So he made a choice that would scar his sons forever. To prove his loyalty to the Sultan, he handed over his children. Vlad and his younger brother, Radu, were taken from their home, shipped off to the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Call it what it really was, a hostage exchange. The medieval version of play nice, or your kids don't come back. They arrived in Edirne, the Ottoman capital, not as guests, not as students, as leverage. Every meal they ate, every smile they saw, was a reminder that their father's loyalty was the only thing keeping them alive. The irony, the Ottomans thought they were breaking Vlad. They were building him. He studied their armies, their discipline, their cruelty. He saw how fear could hold 1,000 men in line. And he remembered Radu, the younger brother, adapted. He learned Turkish, dressed like them, even charmed the royal court. He became Radu the Handsome. But Vlad was different. He hated every second of it. The smells, the rules, the humiliation. He bowed when they made him bow. But in his mind, he was sharpening knives. Years passed, and what the Ottomans didn't realize was that they were teaching Vlad their language of power, punishment, control, fear. They were handing him the tools he would one day use against them. So when people later whispered about the man who impaled his enemies, the man who terrified the Sultan himself, they forgot where he learned it. He learned it in their palaces. He learned it in silence. He learned it while staring at the walls of a golden prison, dreaming of the day he would turn their lessons back on them. When the Ottomans finally released him, he wasn't a boy anymore. He was steel, cold, sharp, unforgiving. They thought they'd tamed him. Instead, they'd forged a weapon. When Vlad finally returned home, he wasn't coming back to a kingdom. He was coming back to a graveyard. His father murdered, his older brother tortured and buried alive. The boyars, the noble class of Wallachia, the very men who should have protected them, had turned traitor. They sold their loyalty to whoever paid more, and when the price was right, they killed their own king. So Vlad walked through the ruins of his family's name, and he made a promise. If the world demanded monsters, then he would become one. But this time, the monster would serve him. Wallachia was chaos. Ottomans pressing from the south, Hungary whispering from the north. And between them, a land that barely remembered what peace felt like. Ruling Wallachia wasn't sitting on a throne. It was standing in a fire pit. Vlad understood one thing. Fear was stronger than loyalty, and he had no interest in being loved. The boyars thought they could control him. They saw a young prince, hungry for power, desperate for approval. They were wrong. Legend says Vlad invited them to a grand feast, music, wine, laughter filling the hall. And then he asked them a simple question. How many princes have you served? The answers came quick. Too quick. They had served many. Too many. Vlad smiled. He ordered them all executed. Some were impaled, others forced to march until they dropped dead building his fortress. It was brutal. It was merciless. But it was also order. That day, the nobles learned something. Vlad was not a puppet. He was the hand pulling the strings. And the people, the peasants, the farmers, the forgotten, they saw something different. For the first time, a ruler who punished corruption, who made the rich tremble and the poor feel safe. He was terrifying, but he was theirs. So when Vlad finally sat on the throne, it wasn't a coronation. It was a warning. A new kind of ruler had arrived. One forged by betrayal, hardened by captivity, fueled by rage. And the world was about to remember his name. By now, Vlad was no longer just a prince. He was a storm, a human weapon. And when the Ottomans came knocking, he didn't send diplomats. He sent fear. This wasn't war the way movies show it. No chivalry. No shining armor. No trumpet calls. This was psychological warfare. Raw. Calculated. And horrifying. The Ottomans called him Kazakh the Impaler Prince. And it wasn't a nickname. It was a warning. When Ottoman raiders crossed into Wallachia, Vlad didn't just fight them. He staged a performance. He captured them alive, sharpened thousands of stakes, and turned the landscape into a nightmare. Impalement was slow, painful, public. It wasn't just about killing. It was about showing. Each body became a message. Each stake, a sentence written in fear. Forget medieval banners. Forget scrolls and declarations. Vlad's diplomacy was a field of corpses. His version of a press release? One day, Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople himself, marched into Wallachia with a massive army. Over 100,000 men. A force so large it could erase a kingdom in a week. But when they entered Vlad's land, they found something they didn't expect. Silence. Smoke. Rot. And then, they saw it. A forest. Not of trees, but of men, 20,000 impaled bodies. Soldiers. Traitors. Prisoners. Lined up as far as the eye could see, their faces frozen in agony. When Mehmed saw it, he stopped. Even he, the man who broke Constantinople, hesitated. The conqueror turned back. Vlad didn't outnumber his enemies. He outthought them. He turned terror into armor. He weaponized fear itself. To outsiders, he was a monster. To his people, he was protection. For the first time in generations, Wallachia stood firm. No tribute. No submission. And if it took hell to hold the line, then Vlad was willing to become the devil himself. Here's the irony. The man who terrified the greatest empire on earth was praised by one side and cursed by the other. To some, Vlad was a savior. To others, he was a demon wearing a crown. In Rome, word of his victories spread fast. The Vatican called him a defender of Christendom, a hero who stood between Europe and the Ottoman tide. While kings argued, while nobles feasted, Vlad fought. And for a moment, he looked like the perfect champion. But there's always a catch. Europe loved a hero. As long as that hero stayed far away, it was easy to celebrate Vlad. When his cruelty was aimed at the Turks, harder. When they realized he treated his own nobles the same way. And then came the pamphlets. Europe had just discovered a new toy, the printing press. And what better way to use it than to sell horror stories? Soon, woodcuts and leaflets spread like wildfire. They showed Vlad dining among corpses, dipping his bread in blood, smiling as men screamed on stakes. Medieval clickbait. And it sold. If BuzzFeed had existed back then, the headline would have read, 10 horrific things Vlad the Impaler did number 6 will make you vomit. People loved it. The darker the story, the faster it spread. Sound familiar? But here's what those pamphlets missed. For the peasants of Wallachia, for the people who actually lived under his rule, Vlad wasn't a monster. He was justice. He punished thieves. He destroyed corrupt nobles. He made the powerful bleed for once. Yes, he was cruel. But for the powerless, his cruelty was protection. To the Ottomans, he was terror itself. To the Pope, he was a crusader. To German printers, he was free advertising. One man, 4 stories, none of them the truth. And maybe that's the problem. Vlad wasn't good. He wasn't evil. He was survival in its rawest, bloodiest form. The world didn't know how to label him, so they turned him into a legend instead. For years, Vlad ruled through terror. He crushed invaders, silenced traitors, and made the mighty tremble. But here's the thing about ruling through fear. It keeps enemies away, but it also keeps allies from getting too close. The boyars, the nobles of Wallachia, had never forgiven him. He had burned their estates, killed their sons, erased their power. And they waited, quietly, patiently. Hungary too began to shift. King Matthias Corvinus, The man who once called Vlad a Christian hero suddenly started avoiding his letters. Vlad's reputation had gone global. The same pamphlets that once made him famous now made him dangerous. Europe loved stories about monsters, but they didn't want to sit next to one. And that's when the trap closed. In 1462, after one last brutal campaign against the Ottomans, Vlad found himself surrounded, his army exhausted, his enemies everywhere. And the man he thought was his ally, the King of Hungary, had him arrested. Imagine that. You spend your life defending Europe from invasion, only to be chained by the very people you saved. Medieval politics. Same energy as modern office drama. Work yourself to death, deliver impossible results, and get fired for being too intense. For 12 years, Vlad rotted in Hungarian captivity. The world moved on. The pamphlets kept spreading. Each story darker than the last. The man became a myth, and the myth became a monster. But the truth was far more tragic. Vlad wasn't undone by his enemies. He was undone by his allies, by the kings who used him, by the nobles who feared him, by the world that wanted his courage, but not his methods. The forest of stakes had saved his land, but it had also left him standing alone. And the man who once terrified an empire was now just another prisoner, forgotten, feared, and waiting. Vlad was never meant to die in peace. Men like him don't fade quietly. Their stories end in blood, or not at all. In 1476, after years in captivity, he returned to Wallachia one last time. His throne had changed hands. His enemies had multiplied. But the fire in him had never gone out. He gathered what men he could. Old soldiers, farmers, anyone still willing to fight. And once more, he rode into war. No one knows exactly how it happened. Some say he was betrayed again. Others say he fell in battle, fighting to his last breath. What we know is that when it was over, Vlad was dead. His body lost, his head cut off, sent to Sultan Mehmed II as a gift. The man who once terrified the empire was now reduced to a trophy. But death didn't end him. It amplified him. For the people of Wallachia, Vlad became a symbol, the defender who stood when no one else would. For Europe, he became a cautionary tale, proof that heroes can become monsters when their world refuses to understand them. And centuries later, a writer named Bram Stoker would give Vlad immortality, not as a savior, but as a vampire, a creature of the night, feared, cursed, and misunderstood. That's the tragedy. The real Vlad spilled blood to defend his people. The fictional one spilled blood to entertain them. The hero died in battle. The monster lived forever. 500 years later, we remember the legend, but not the man. And maybe that's the cruelest fate of all, to win the war, but lose your story. And so, after centuries of war, propaganda, and lies, you still know him by one name, Dracula. Not the warrior, not the ruler, not the man who defied an empire. No, you know the cartoon, the cape, the fangs, the Halloween costume. That's history's cruelest joke. It turned a man who bled for his people into a monster who feeds on them. It turned trauma into entertainment, sacrifice into parody. It's like remembering Michael Jordan only for Space Jam. Technically true, but it erases everything that mattered. Vlad III Dracula was never the myth. He was the mirror. He showed Europe what it feared most, its own reflection. The greed, the power, the violence, all dressed up in righteousness. Yes, he was ruthless. Yes, he was cruel. But he was the product of a world that demanded cruelty just to survive. He didn't drink blood. He bled for his country. And the world chose to call him a monster, because that was easier than admitting what made him necessary. So the next time you see a plastic vampire in a store window, or a Dracula movie playing on Halloween night, remember this. Behind the cape stood a man, behind the myth stood a purpose, and behind the horror stood history. Vlad Tepes, prince, soldier, tyrant, savior. He was all of them, and none of them Because in the end, truth didn't survive. The story did. And that story lied.